He fought for freedom with nothing but a sword, a voice, and a cause. William Wallace defied an empire and became the face of Scottish resistance. But in the end, it wasn't the battles that broke him. It was what they did to his body, piece by piece. This is the chilling truth behind Wallace's execution, how power punishes courage, and how a man's end can still echo centuries later. If true royal stories haunt you like they should, don't forget to join us by hitting subscribe. But by the year 1305, William Wallace had become a symbol of defiance. He wasn't a noble by birth. He wasn't trained for courtly games. He was a commoner with uncommon rage, burning against English occupation. After years of guerrilla warfare, he had struck brutal blows against King Edward I's forces, most famously at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But power has a long memory, and Edward never forgave Wallace for making England bleed, the man they couldn't beat on the battlefield. They planned to break in chains. Wallace had been on the run for months, hiding in forests, moving through mountains, aided by sympathizers who still believed in his cause. But betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. In August 1305, he was captured near Glasgow, not by English soldiers, but reportedly by a Scottish knight loyal to Edward. They didn't take him in battle. They took him in silence. Bound in iron chains, Wallace was dragged across the border to London, not as a warrior, but as a warning. The message was clear: defiance would not be forgiven, even by your own. Wallace's journey to London wasn't swift. It was deliberate humiliation. He was paraded through towns, shackled and filthy, while crowds jeered and threw refuse. But he held his head high. He didn't beg. He didn't weep. To the English, he was a traitor. To many Scots, he was a martyr already. By the time he reached the Tower of London, Wallace had become more than a man. He was a symbol the crown feared. And in a kingdom ruled by intimidation, symbols were the most dangerous thing of all. On August 23, 1305, Wallace stood before an English court in Westminster Hall. He was charged with treason against King Edward I. But Wallace spoke only once, and clearly. I could not be a traitor, for I was never his subject. He had never sworn loyalty to England, and therefore rejected their right to judge him. But this was no real trial. No defense was allowed. The sentence had been decided long before he entered the hall. It wasn't justice. It was theater. And the final act would be played on a public stage soaked in blood. The court delivered its sentence with chilling detail. William Wallace would be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most brutal form of execution reserved for enemies of the crown. He would be dragged through the streets, stripped and bound, then hanged until near death, but kept alive. His body would then be opened, his organs removed, and burned before his eyes. Finally, his body would be cut into pieces, sent to the far corners of the kingdom. This was not punishment. It was a performance, crafted to crush not just Wallace, but the spirit of rebellion itself. On the morning of August 23rd, Wallace was stripped, tied to a wooden hurdle, and dragged through the streets of London by horses. The journey was slow, deliberately cruel. Crowds gathered along the route, some mocking, some silent, others weeping. His body bounced violently on the rough path, bones grinding, skin torn. But Wallace didn't scream. He didn't plead. Even broken, he remained defiant. It wasn't just a man being pulled to execution. It was a message being carved into the streets. This is what happens to those who dare defy the crown. At Smithfield, the crowd thickened, eager, anxious, or horrified. A scaffold had been raised, not just for execution, but for spectacle. Wallace was lifted up, his body bruised and bloodied. They hanged him until his breath nearly stopped, long enough for his limbs to twitch, but not enough to grant him death. Then, they brought him down. He gasped, alive but fading, as the next phase began. This wasn't justice. It was theater soaked in cruelty. Every movement was slow, designed to stretch fear across every face in the crowd and to leave a scar. On memory itself, Wallace was laid bare on the platform, and the executioner began the unspeakable. His abdomen was sliced open, slowly, methodically. His insides were pulled out while he was still conscious. His organs, still warm, were thrown into a fire just feet from his eyes. The crowd shifted. Some turned away. Others watched, paralyzed by the horror. This was not simply an execution. It was a public ritual meant to strip a man of his humanity before ending his life. But Wallace, even then, gave them no satisfaction. No screams that could echo louder than his cause. When his body could endure no more, and silence had swallowed the square, the final act began. Wallace was beheaded in one swift motion, at last granting him the peace his tormentors had long denied. But even death wasn't the end. His body was then quartered, cut into 4 parts. Each piece was sent to different towns across England and Scotland: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. His head, dipped in tar, was placed on a spike atop London Bridge. They hoped to erase him, scatter him, and make his story rot in fear. But they failed. That Edward I didn't just want to kill Wallace. He wanted to kill what he stood for. By scattering his body, he hoped to shatter the myth, break the morale, and warn every town that rebellion breeds ruin. But something strange happened. Instead of fear, whispers of admiration grew. People spoke of Wallace not as a criminal, but as a martyr. His brutal death turned him into something the English crown never intended, a symbol of courage carved in suffering. And in trying to bury him across the kingdom, they accidentally planted a legend. In the years after Wallace's execution, his name was spoken quietly in Scottish homes, passed in stories, remembered in whispers. Children grew up hearing of the man who refused to kneel, who endured the worst a king could offer, and still died with fire in his eyes. The English crown had made an example of him, but in doing so, they fueled a quiet resistance. Wallace's memory lingered not in banners or ballads, but in the hearts of a people who had seen their freedom mutilated and wanted it back. Edward, I believed brutality would ensure control, but Wallace's ghost proved harder to silence. Even as Edward grew older, his war with Scotland continued, draining his treasury and haunting his court. On his deathbed in 1307, Edward ordered his bones to be carried into battle. So great was his obsession with destroying the cause Wallace had sparked. But the cause had already outlived him. The torch of rebellion had passed to others. And though Edward died a king, Wallace, cut down, broken, and scattered, had become something even more powerful, a story too dangerous to forget. Just a few years after Wallace's execution, another Scottish leader emerged, Robert the Bruce. He had once hesitated, even opposed Wallace. But now, fueled by the memory of what Wallace endured, he united the clans and led a renewed fight for independence. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, the Scots defeated a much larger English force. It was a turning point, one born in Wallace's shadow. Though he never saw that victory, it carried his spirit. His suffering had not been in vain. It had become fuel for the fire that burned on. Over the centuries, William Wallace's story outgrew history books. He became legend, myth, symbol. Monuments were built, songs were sung, and centuries later, even films would try to capture the scale of his sacrifice. But behind all the storytelling, one truth remained untouched. Wallace wasn't driven by fame, but by freedom. He didn't live for glory. He died because he refused to submit. And that refusal, so raw, so costly, spoke louder than any crown ever could. England tried to silence him in pieces. Instead, they immortalized him in flame. Today, more than 700 years later, William Wallace's voice still echoes, not through speeches or relics, but in the idea that one person's courage can shake an empire. He had no army, no throne, no royal blood, and yet he challenged the greatest power of his age and paid the highest price. His body was broken, but his story was not. Wallace's execution was meant to end a rebellion. Instead, it began something larger, a legacy that reminds the world that freedom has a voice. And sometimes, that voice dies screaming, but never in vain.